We are in week 3 of our 7-week fall series. We're working with this book up here called Falling Upward, A Spirituality for the Two Halves of Life by Richard Rohr, who I like to describe as the happy heretic. He doesn't call what he has to say heresy, he calls it alternative orthodoxy, but I'm here to say they're the same thing. We've talked about that before. And last week I left you with what I thought was a wonderful little quote from another author who also writes about this concept of the two halves of life. Here it is again. The world is more magical, less predictable, more autonomous, less controllable, more varied, less simple, more infinite, less knowable, more wonderfully troubling than we could have imagined being able to tolerate when we were young. That's great. I mean, it's sort of like saying, if I knew then what I know now, or maybe another way to put it is that in the second half of life, the things that seemed intolerable during the first half have this funny way of becoming maybe not just tolerable, but even enjoyable, right? Things like I don't know, haircuts and classical music and maybe I don't know, dad jokes, you know, things like that. And speaking of dad jokes, this is one that only people who are in the second half, definitely in the second half, would be able to understand. All right. So if Lawrence Welk had twin girls, what would their names be?
Wonderful, wonderful.
Anna 1, Anna 2. See what I mean? See, you're in that first half life. If you're not old enough, that one right over your head. And what do you call a person who tells dad jokes but has no children? A faux pas. All right. Alrighty, I get the message. Time to move on. The first half of life is the time that contains what I think of as the rebellious years, as exemplified by the terrible twos and especially the teen years. And although I have no children of my own, I have witnessed vicariously how my various friends and family have dealt with the 2-year-old tantrums and teenage rebellions. And I would say that the ones who ended up with the healthiest children from an emotional and psychological perspective were the ones who had firm guidelines, clear expectations, and could allow for a substantial degree of freedom within the structure that they imposed. Sounds like a daunting prospect, but a lot of people have done it and done it well. Now recall for a moment that Carl Jung, the famous psychologist, was the one who came up with this concept of the two halves of life, and this is what he had to say about it. The first half of life is devoted to forming a healthy ego. The second half is going inward and letting go of it. All right, so there you go. Got to have the ego, then you have to let go of it. Or as Richard Rohr puts it, he says that the first half is about creating this strong container, a strong and healthy container, and then in the second half of life, we're filling it up. And remember, just because they use the phrase two halves, it doesn't mean that there is this big, fat dividing line between the two, or that there's some kind of a rigid chronological time frame that's going to be the same for everyone. It's a process. It's a process we encounter in life, and just like any orderly process, there are steps that need to unfold in the proper sequence. You need the container before you can fill it. You need the net before you can catch any fish. You need the bucket before you can bring home the berries. So, here's how it starts in the first half of life. And I think this is a quote that will warm the hearts of even the most ardent, self-labeled conservatives, all right? Here it is. The first half of life container is constructed through impulse controls, traditions, group symbols, family loyalties, basic respect for authority, civil and church laws, and a sense of the goodness, value, and special importance of your country, ethnicity, and religion. To quote Archimedes once again, you must have both a lever and a place to stand before you can move the world. Now, once you have that, then you can move on. And this is how he says that the two parts of the process can work together. Here's some perspectives on the two parts working together. He says, you need a strong container to hold the contents and contradictions that arrive later in life. You ironically need a very strong ego structure, and a healthy one too, to let go of your ego. You need to struggle with the rules more than a bit before you throw them out. You only internalize values by butting up against external values for a while. Now you can see these ideas playing out in other areas of life, and I'm just going to name one of them here this morning. Where I see it most clearly playing out, this interplay, this juxtaposition, is in the arts, especially in music. I love listening to jazz. I love the spontaneity, the improvisation, the give and take among the musicians on stage, especially in live performances. But the only way that great jazz comes into existence is because the musicians first learn how to master their instruments and how to master and follow the rules of music. Only after they master the rules are they able to throw them out and then effectively experiment and improvise. You can't do free form unless you know the rules. Otherwise it sounds like garbage, right? And the ego is really important. When you're learning the instrument, you really have to believe that you can do it. You got to have that drive and motivation. The ego can be a great motivator when you're learning the instrument and the rules. However, an egotistical musician who likes to show off and not let other people have their place in the spotlight usually don't enjoy much in the way of long-term success, especially in the jazz realm. So, how are we doing as a culture when it comes to successfully navigating this two-stage process? Not too well, according to the author. This is what he says. The educated and sophisticated Western person today has many levers, but almost no solid place on which to stand, with either very weak identities or terribly overstated identities. Either way, weak identity or terribly overstated identity, we end up with adults who have no principled or ethical sense of themselves, who engage in some kind of pick and choose morality driven by the needs and desires of the moment, and especially the desires, right? It's a pattern that leaves the unhealthy ego totally in charge. So one of the things that this book is trying to accomplish is to create a shift in consciousness. And a shift in consciousness is really just a change in our thought process and a change in our values, which can help more people see and appreciate the importance of healthy limitations, boundaries, rules, and certain traditions. How else can we learn how to overcome and accomplish unless we're up against something? Unless we're pushing up against some kind of boundary or being pushed ourselves to the limit of our own resourcefulness. You don't grow without that. A lot of it's no fun, but there's no growth if you don't have that. Now, earlier I mentioned that the author Richard Rohr, I called him the happy heretic, and in these chapters we're looking at today, he says something that might sound like rank heresy, especially to the New Age crowd. He quotes psychologist Erich Fromm, who said this: "The healthiest people he has known, and those who very often grow up in the most natural way, are those who, between their two parents and early authority figures, experienced a combination of unconditional love along with very conditional and demanding love." May sound heretical to some people because we've grown into this, I don't know how it happened, but this idea that, the only kind of love that's worth looking at or talking about is unconditional love. People who define unconditional love as being totally incompatible with things like constructive criticism, enforcing rules, or even firmly expressing disapproval in a loving way, but when necessary to express disapproval. I think maybe a better way of looking at this idea of conditional love is to look at it as what we sometimes call tough love. Tough love. Tough love means you still have the person's best interests in mind. You want what's best for them, and you're going to require accountability and demand that they take responsibility for their actions, that sort of thing. On the other hand, unconditional love is the foundation of things like mercy, forgiveness, and patience even. That's where those things come from, is unconditional love. Without unconditional love, you're not even going to get to tough love, because before you get to tough love, without unconditional love, you're going to write the person off. You're going to write them off completely. What unconditional love does is it provides the assurance that I'll always be here for you, but I won't be a pushover. And I think that's a subtle but necessary distinction that we really need to take a hard look at in our culture. So one of the things that happens during this second stage consciousness is that we learn to really appreciate the people who practice tough love. Now, I'm not talking about a bully or anyone who is abusive or anything like that. I'm talking about the kind of people who held us to a higher standard, who required our best effort and would hold us accountable without being punitive. That's an important distinction. Hold us accountable without being punitive. I can think of teachers in grade school. I can even think of professors in law school especially who came across as demanding and tough and things like that. And I can recall all sorts of griping and complaining about them from me and others. And then one day, after you've had this shift in consciousness, there comes this aha moment, right? All of a sudden, you finally get what they were trying to do. And you finally see, oh, that's how it all worked. That's how it helped me to become better at what I did. In the book, he calls this interplay a kind of creative tension. A creative tension. It's creative because both law and freedom are necessary for growth. And one of the ways that he suggests learning how to appreciate and use that creative tension is by developing what he calls a contemplative mind. Here's what he says. Without a contemplative mind, we do not know how to hold creative tensions. We are better at rushing to judgment and demanding a complete resolution to things before we have learned what they have to teach us. This is not the way of wisdom, and it is the way that people operate in the first half of life. So he's basically giving you a non-example of what contemplative mind is. With contemplative mind, we learn how to not rush to judgment. We learn how to not demand a complete resolution to things. We get a little more comfortable with ambiguity. The contemplative mind understands the need to move beyond rigid adherence to the rules, blind obedience to law and authority. It knows when the time is to move beyond that, and by doing that, we can formulate our own, call it an internal, authentic adult conscience, something that's within us that can discern right and wrong instead of having to rely on externals to tell us what's right and wrong. We get to figure it out for ourselves. And this helps in situations that might be a little bit ambiguous. We come up against a situation that's not covered by the rule book, right? That's not covered by the authorities, and a lot of people flounder. It doesn't have to be that way. In the book, he uses a term for moving beyond this law and order blind obedience stage. He calls the process discharging your loyal soldier. Discharging your loyal soldier. Now, this is a concept that he says comes to us from post-World War II Japan. And there were some communities there who decided to help to ease the transition back to civilian life of their soldiers as they were returning home. The soldiers would be brought into the public square or some other place out in public. They would be publicly thanked and praised for their service. And then they were told that this community needs something different from you now. What the community needed would require them to let go of what had served them, and actually everyone else, what had served everyone well during the wartime years, and to learn a different way of being, a different way of being in the world. which would build on the discipline and the obedience and all the things that the soldier embodied, but which would also go way beyond that. And the term that we use for that process is we call it transcend and include. Both and instead of either or. Now this is something that he's suggesting by this example of discharging your loyal soldier. This is something that could be done consciously and directly, and perhaps even treated as a rite of passage, which is what they were doing there. Rites of passage, those are other things that we're not particularly good at in our culture. But one of the ways that you can see this process is something else that he touches on in the book. He mentions Abraham Maslow in a few places. Now, you might remember Maslow. Are they still teaching this in school? I sure hope so, because Maslow was an American psychologist who was best known for creating this thing that is called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And we have the pyramid up here, I think. Good. There it is, the hierarchy of needs. This is another great example of transcend and include, the necessity of moving from one stage to another. That great big bottom layer there, that's the one that everything sits on, right? Those are the survival and physiological needs: food, water, warmth, rest. If you don't get those, you're not going to get anything else. If you don't get those, it's game over, right? Now, once we're good at surviving, then we need to move up into the safety and security needs, all right? And then everything else rests on those two bottom foundations. You can't get rid of those bottom foundations. You have to include them, but you also have to transcend them. You have to keep moving up in terms of spiritual and psychological growth. But the bottom layers are important. They have to be there, and they also have to serve as a means to get up to the next levels. So you look at the safety needs there, the second layer, that is the law and order stage. That is the place where, say, our loyal soldier likes to dwell. And at some point we need to be invited, somehow, to move up to the next stage. And those top three layers are perhaps where our greatest human potential can be found. And maybe there is no top layer. Maybe there should be an opening on the top of that, because there could be more that we still have yet to discover. But at the very least, we'll reach that top point, that top part of the pyramid, which is where we have succeeded in internalizing the values and the virtues that are actually at the basis of the law and order stage. So we end up learning that we can be ethical and good human beings, not because the law requires it or because of reward and punishment, but we are good and ethical human beings because it's obviously the right thing to do. That's the big change from the second level to the top level. You know, there may come a time when following the law is clearly not the right thing to do, as Rosa Parks and Gandhi and Dr. King showed us. But they did that. They broke the law. They refused to follow the law, not for egotistical purposes or for personal fame and notoriety. They did it out of this larger and more refined sense of morality, justice, and ethics that the rest of the world at that time wasn't yet able to see. Today, we regard what they did as right and even heroic. Back then, as you can see, they locked them up for being lawbreakers. And because they did what they did, the world changed. So that's the importance of this process of navigating it, of being invited to change and to internalize our values and learn how to deal with ambiguity and injustice from a different state of consciousness. So next week we're going to start looking at the transition phase. And the transition phase is marked by a lot of different things, often some unavoidable or even necessary suffering, and also from making mistakes and failings, which are other things that our culture is very, very bad at tolerating, right? Because you make a mistake, if you fail at something, right, you're a loser. That's an attitude that needs to change. So we'll be taking a look at the transition phase that begins taking us from the first half to the second half, and that'll be next week. We'll be meeting in the teen room at 11:30 this morning to talk and I was going to say answer questions. I don't answer questions, I respond to questions, so because there are no answers. So I will respond to your questions and we can discuss things, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.